Is this a sword? Or is this a sword? How important is sound design in a video game? Today, we have Dave Chan on the show talking about sound design and BioWare in part 4 of my BioWare Stories. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. Welcome to part 4 of my BioWare Stories. In this episode, I'm lucky to have Dave Chan talking about sound design and more. Dave started working at BioWare before me on games such as MDK2, Baldur's Gate, and Baldur's Gate 2. We overlapped on games such as Neverwinter Nights, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and Jade Empire. Dave has had a long career in video games. For a full list, I've linked to his profile on Moby Games in my show notes. But today, let's get right down to it.
Hi, I'm Dave Chan. I've been fortunate enough to have worked on video games for over 20 years, primarily as a sound designer, audio director, that sort of thing. I've been lucky enough to work on some pretty nice games at BioWare and a few others since then. But I've also worked on small indie titles that I have just as much fun working on as well. So, the only other thing that I do quite frequently that I really like that I wish I could do more of is voiceover directing, because I have a lot of fun.
So Dave, you and I met when I worked at BioWare, but you'd already been working at BioWare when I joined. I joined in 2001. You had already been there already, I think, if I remember correctly. And I can see in the background of your studio office there that you have Neverwinter Nights, you have Baldur's Gate, and I think a mech that almost looks like something out of Shattered Steel. So when did you get into the video game industry and doing sound design?
Well, I've always been a dabbler in music. I've always loved synthesizers. I worked at various places, tried to get jobs at recording studios, but the old catch-22 got me. So I ended up going more into IT stuff. I was working at a computer store, and one day Greg walks in because they were looking for some stuff for the office back at, I think, when they were above what's called the Red Bike or something. And I didn't know who this guy was. He had one of these racks of like some cheap ass shareware in boxes. And one of them was called, I think, Blasteroids or something. And he said, "Oh, I worked on that game." I'm like, "Wow, that's cool." I had never really met anybody that worked on games. I looked a little bit more into BioWare and stuff like that. And I remember saying to my girlfriend at the time, "I'm going to work there." Eventually I did. I got my Microsoft Systems Engineer certification. I called up BioWare and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to have me, come in and do some work?" Because it was an IT thing, I ended up in the IT department with Dave Ham. At some point, just from talking casually and everything like that, Greg knew that I was into music and sound. And he said to me one day, he goes, "Hey, do you know anybody that might be able to do sound effects? Because we need some placeholder stuff for MDK2 because Interplay's pipeline is just too full right now." So I said, "Well, I dabble in that stuff. I could give it a try." It got to the point where they were happy enough with what I was doing that they said, "We want you full-time on the audio side." Dumped in their trial by fire. Came time where Interplay had the bandwidth to help us. And their sort of lead there, his name is Charles Deenan. He's pretty well known in the industry. He, was like, "Okay, send me a build." And he's like, "Wow, that's not bad." I was devastated. I was like, "Oh man, I put my heart and soul into this." And then Trent says, "Charles said your work wasn't bad." He goes, "Wow, he must think the sun shines out of your ass." And I'm like, "What?" And he said, "Oh, he never compliments anyone." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So anyway, that's kind of where it started. MDK2 and then Neverwinter Nights, Knights of the Old Republic. I just, as time went along, I just learned more and more. I had to. For the longest time, I was like the only audio person for, fairly decent sized developer.
When you were working on the original games like MDK2, you worked on MDK2, you worked on Neverwinter Nights, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, of at least the three, and then of course there was a more later on. When these were being done, the studio was really tiny, small, very scrappy. What can you remember some of the highlights that you can remember from your time then?
Being scrappy was fun in terms of like just everybody felt like they were moving in the same direction. Like I'm not going to get into the Death March crunch because it's a pretty common story, but when things were going well, we were just having fun. People would come up with crazy ideas and try them out because, there wasn't any kind of like super hierarchy. So I remember one time about 3 a.m, we were working on MDK2 and everybody was just dragged. We were all like just 3 a.m. We're very, very tired. There's 3 characters in the game. There's Max, the 4-armed dog. There's Dr. Hawkins. He's kind of mad scientist. And then Kurt Hektek is the protagonist, in the special suit. Part of the character of the doctor was he could combine things like radioactive material and a toaster, and then he would get a toaster that shot radioactive bread. Anyway, Wes Borg had done this one outtake, and the original line was like, I have a goldfish and I forget, but it was like, 2 sort of disparate things that kind of worked together and made a weapon. But I remember he had an outtake line that just cracked everybody up at the studio. It was like, I've got a monkey in a blow dryer. Now where's the KY jelly? And so I snuck that in the build, and that was fun. I mean, it was like everybody, was just so tired, but that kind of tomfoolery probably at most of the bigger serious developers wouldn't happen these days. Like,
I loved MDK2. It was a tough game though. Holy crap.
oh yeah.
I don't know if I ever finished that game. It was such a tough game.
I'd make a joking name about it. It's like too easy itis or something like that, where you end up in these situations that the QA team gets so good that they go, this section is way too easy. And so, the designers make it a little more difficult. Meat Circus in the first Psychonauts was a perfect example of that as well. I talked to one of the developers because that's one of my favorite games of all time, Psychonauts. And I said, why is the game has difficult sections, but why the hell is Meat Circus so hard? And he told me the exact same story. He said, well, the QA guys, the testers kept saying, this is too easy. So they would just keep cranking the difficulty. They didn't do enough testing with somebody who's not been playing the game forever and, getting an outside view of it. But yeah, that's one of the reasons why MDK2 was pretty hard, is that, they just, the testers were going at it and trying to they were competing with each other and stuff like that. And so that made the game really hardcore.
Do you remember any stories of sound design that listeners who are really big fans of these games, might not know how some of these sound effects were created, or perhaps some funny stories around the sound and the sound engineering and the audio engineering?
Yeah, Knights of the Old Republic was an interesting one. We did a lot in-house. Most of the creature sounds were done by a gentleman named Paul Gorman, really awesome sound designer. Lucas handled all of the voiceover and stuff like that. We didn't touch it, but none of the sounds in there were actually taken from the movies. They were all, if it sounds like it was from the movies, it was reproduced by us or somebody on the contracting team. I did a lot of the weapon sounds and the user interface sounds and things like that. We tried to stick thematically to what we thought it would sound like in that universe, being consistent with the movies, but not actually pulling from the movies. People would often say, and I remember reading reviews that, they use Star Wars sound effects. It's awesome. That sounds so good. It sounds so realistic. And I'm thinking to myself, like, somebody said, well, doesn't that kind of make you mad? And I'm like, hell no. Ben Burt, who is like one of the main sound designers, he's extremely famous in the film and TV industry, did a lot of the Star Wars sound effects, the laser shots and stuff. He, radio tower or something like that, the metal cables that come down, and he would hit them with like a hammer or something. And that's how you get that laser sound. Anyway, I just said, no, if someone mistakes anything I did for something that Ben Burt did, I'm happy. Even the fact that, I mean, Baldur's Gate, the first one, had the most recorded dialogue of any video game up to that point. We knew that, but maybe a lot of other people didn't know that. But that's crazy. Like, we were a small, untested studio, really. Like, recording voiceover is not cheap, but I guess the buzz was enough that Interplay was willing to pony up and cover the costs for that. But we didn't have somebody standing behind us going, no, you can't have that. But you cut that VO down, way down. And just the grandeur, like the size of the games. If you play all of the side quests in BG2, I think it's at least 80 hours. And I think it's more. And you get a lot of passion from people, like you were saying earlier, that they become so passionate about the game that there was one instance, Trent in his office had this wall where he would put up letters that we would get, like actual physical letters back in the day. And there was this one guy who had been playing BG2. He had played it through like 3 times, and he sent like 2 pages, single spaced, really tight handwriting of what he thought was wrong with the game and where it could be improved. And I'm like, how much passion do you have to have about something that you don't think, you're externally saying, yeah, this isn't up to the quality bar I expect, but you still played through it almost like 200 hours or more. So that's the kind of things that when you have characters and story that really engage people, you get passionate fans. Like, they just want, they want to be invested in those characters. I remember, I lost them along the way somewhere, but I wish I still had them. I had a bunch of the actor that played Minsk, just tons and tons of outtakes that I just wish had gotten to the game. We did have a few rares, when you used to poke them, and he would comments about Boo, the giant miniature space hamster. Yeah, I mean, those characters to this day are still resonating with people.
I think anyone who's listening who's ever played Baldur's Gate and has any memory of Minsk and Boo, knowing that you had outtakes that nobody has heard and since then, probably are going, what, Dave? What?
Oh, and yeah, there another sort of voiceover thing. Oh, Interplay handled most of the localization, which for people that don't know is like putting the game in different languages. Things like battle sounds and things like that were a little more sort of integrated into the engine that had to be put in on our end. So we would get the German, the Spanish, and the French, and all of the French combat sounds sounded like porn. Like, I remember playing a bunch of them in my office. I think it was Kevin Martin's I was playing for, and people were walking by the door looking in going, what the hell?
That's great. What is it that you want to accomplish with the audio when a gamer picks up the game, puts it in, and where does audio fit into the experience for you?
For me, when I understand what the goal is, what they're going for, like when I worked on The Long Dark, we were trying to portray a sense of desolate loneliness. You're walking through this vast winter landscape where things want to kill you. You're just trying to survive. Keeping that in mind, that's where all the sound effects came in. Like, for the most part, we had just a very quiet ambient bed with the occasional trees waving or whatever, and like maybe a wolf howling in the distance, and sometimes there would be once in a while birds, but we didn't want to make it feel like it was like teeming with life, because that sort of went against the whole desolate isolation sort of point of view. So yeah, so once I understand that, that kind of informs everything I do from there.
I am going to ask you a series of rapid fire questions with some short answers from you.
Okay.
Best video game of all time.
There's contenders for the top 5 that would rotate in and out, but Half-Life 2 was the video game that kind of cemented my love of first-person shooters, and it was like the first game that I played that I felt like I was actually in a cohesive world.
Best BioWare game.
I'm going to say Mass Effect, like the whole Mass Effect series. I loved KOTOR. Mass Effect just had that really well-balanced, action versus story that I think is great.
Best voice character you have ever had the pleasure of listening to in a video game.
Ooh, that's a good one. Non-BioWare, it would be probably Claptrap from the Borderlands series. The dialogue there, it was always funny. I always laughed when I would hear him say stuff. BioWare games, probably Minsk, because he's just, even to this day, he's in Baldur's Gate 3. So, obviously that character resonates.
Best sound effect or craziest sound effect you've ever had to produce?
Generally, the craziest ones were spell sounds, because I can't think of like a specific one, but spell sounds are always a huge challenge in Baldur's Gate and that sort of thing. You had not just the sound effects, but you also had usually it was chanting. A lot of times it was like Latin played backwards, but it was, having that balance between feeling like, the wizard is invoking something, and then you get this super complex swirling, maybe some different particles coming in and out and explosions. And yeah, that sort of stuff is probably the most challenging. The other thing that a lot of people don't think about that is actually really challenging, and I think a lot of sound designers will agree with this, is user interface sounds. A user interface sound has to be a few things. It has to be noticeable. If you're getting feedback that your health is low, or if you click an accept button, or, you add a custom piece to your weapon or something like that, it has to be noticeable and it has to sort of cut through everything. And it also has to be unique, because obviously when you hear a sound and you don't have time to look at what's happening, that sound is the feedback. You go, oh shit, I'm almost out of ammo, or something like that. And then lastly, it has to be not annoying. So you have to make a sound that people will hear thousands of times, possibly. It has to fill all those criteria and not be annoying.
The most annoying sound that you've ever had to listen to?
This is Half-Life related, and I just love the Half-Life series, but there was an expansion pack. I think it was Blue Shift. I saw this gun, and I went and picked it up. And it was this massive, just huge gun. And I was like, oh, this is going to sound amazing. Charged it up and fired. And it was like the wimpiest. Apologies to whoever designed it, but it was like, and it was shooting like a frozen ice ball. And I get what they were going for, but it just didn't have any sort of gravitas to it, any bass, any impact. This is the most disappointing weapon I have ever used in a video game. It probably did a fair amount of damage, but it wasn't fun firing it. That's part of the whole playing video games is, when in games where you're using weapons like that, is it's fun, shooting stuff and getting a new weapon and see what it sounds like,
Dave, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, talking about sound design, BioWare, and games.
Thanks, dude. It's good to see you.
You might be wondering about a couple names thrown about in this episode. The Greg that Dave refers to is Greg Zeschuk, one of the co-CEOs and founders of BioWare. The Trent that Dave refers to is Trent Oster, one of the founders and CEO of Beamdog. He is also the man who helped bring Neverwinter Nights to life amongst any other number of titles in the games industry and at BioWare. Trent will also be my guest next week on Tales Under the Cat Tree. However, I need to warn you, Trent and I will not be talking about games. I do want to thank Dave for coming on the show. If you want to listen to my other BioWare stories, listen to parts 1 and 2 with Craig Miller. That's episodes 27 and 28. And of course, part number 3 with ex-designers Georg Zoller and Emmanuel Lucinci on episode 29. I hope to bring you more BioWare stories in the future. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dupes.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human imagination. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please help me reach more people by subscribing or sharing this episode. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by Dilip Vijayawardena. Give your pets a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.